Detroit had a dirty secret in the 60s and 70s, and it wasn't about performance, it was about fear. Some of the most powerful, most beautiful, most brutally engineered cars America ever built were murdered by their own creators after just 12 months on sale. Not because they failed, not because buyers hated them. In almost every single case, these cars were killed while they were still winning, still selling, still terrifying the competition, because a boardroom somewhere decided the risk wasn't worth the reward anymore. Insurance companies panicked. Racing bodies rewrote rulebooks overnight specifically to stop them. Corporate executives got nervous about lawsuits and image and where the industry was heading, and so they pulled the plug on machines that today are worth more than most people's houses. If you own one of these 8 cars, you are not just holding a piece of metal, you are holding the physical evidence of a moment Detroit tried to erase. Stick around until the very end, because the #1 car on this list has a backstory so absurd, so almost unbelievable, that dealerships were begging factories to take the cars back, and what happened to those unsold units will honestly shock you. Let's start the countdown. Number 8. The 1957 Rambler Rebel. Before muscle cars even had a name, before Detroit fully understood what raw horsepower stuffed into a mid-size body could do to American car buyers, a struggling little independent automaker called American Motors accidentally invented the blueprint. AMC was fighting for survival in 1957. It didn't have the budget of General Motors or Ford, and it desperately needed a halo car, something that would make headlines and prove that a small company could still build something extraordinary. Engineers took the mid-size Rambler platform, a car nobody expected to be fast, and dropped in a 327 cubic inch V8 pumping out 255 horsepower through Bendix electronic fuel injection, technology so advanced for the era that most competitors wouldn't catch up for another decade. On paper, this modest-looking family sedan could outrun a Chevrolet Corvette in a straight line. Automotive journalists were stunned. Here was an unassuming 4-door car that could humiliate sports cars costing twice as much. It should have been the beginning of a legend. Instead, it became one of Detroit's earliest cautionary tales. AMC's supplier could not produce the electronic fuel injection system in any meaningful volume, and the mechanical bugs in that early system meant most Rebels that actually reached customers were fitted with a more conventional 4-barrel carburetor instead, producing a still respectable but far less mythical 255 horsepower through traditional means. Combined with sky-high pricing, a recession squeezing the entire auto industry, and a corporate decision to refocus resources on economical compact cars rather than performance flagships, the Rebel's fate was sealed before it even had a chance to build momentum. Fewer than 1,500 were built, and the following year, the performance version vanished completely, replaced by ordinary trim levels wearing the Rebel name with none of the fire underneath. What makes this one-year wonder so haunting is the timing. This was 1957, years before Pontiac would drop a big engine into the GTO and get credit for creating the muscle car. AMC beat everyone to the punch, and then walked away from its own invention, handing the entire concept to bigger rivals who would spend the next decade profiting from an idea a nearly bankrupt company had already proven could work. Number 7. The 1969 Ford Torino Talladega. This is where things start getting genuinely strange, because this car wasn't built to be driven by regular people at all. It was built to win a war that was happening on NASCAR superspeedways, and ordinary customers were almost an afterthought. By the late 1960s, stock car racing had become an arms race between manufacturers, and aerodynamics were the new battlefield. Ford's engineers discovered that a standard Torino got shredded by wind resistance at nearly 200 miles an hour, so they stretched the nose 5 inches longer, smoothed the front end, tucked the bumper in tighter, and created something that looked almost identical to a normal Torino from 20 feet away, but behaved completely differently at racing speeds. NASCAR required manufacturers to actually sell a minimum number of these specialty cars to the public to prove they weren't just one-off race prototypes, a rule called homologation. So Ford built exactly enough Talladegas, historians estimate around 754, to satisfy the rulebook, slapped a 428 Cobra Jet V8 under the hood, producing a conservatively rated 335 horsepower, and quietly shipped them to dealerships that had no idea how to market or sell what was essentially a street-legal race car homologation special. On the track, the strategy worked brilliantly. Talladega dominated NASCAR superspeedway racing in 1969, winning race after race and validating every dollar Ford had spent on aerodynamic research. But that same success triggered the car's downfall. NASCAR officials, worried the aero wars were spiraling completely out of control and making the sport unrecognizable, rewrote the rulebook for 1970, effectively outlawing the extreme aerodynamic modifications that made cars like the Talladega dominant. With the racing purpose gone and no real civilian market clamoring for a stretched-nose specialty, Torino, Ford killed the Talladega after a single model year. Today, surviving examples are almost impossible to find in original condition, and most serious muscle car collectors consider it one of the most underappreciated homologation specials Detroit ever produced, a car built purely to win, that vanished the moment the rules changed specifically to stop it from winning. Number 6. The 1969 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler II. If the Talladega feels like an obscure footnote, wait until you hear about its cousin, because almost nobody outside serious Ford enthusiast circles even knows this car existed. Mercury, Ford's slightly more upscale sibling brand, wanted its own version of the aerodynamic warfare happening on NASCAR tracks, so it took the same stretched nose, smooth fascia treatment developed for the Talladega and applied it to the Cyclone, creating a car that looked subtly but distinctly different from any Mercury before or after it. Underneath sat that same devastating 428 Cobra Jet V8, and the car was built for exactly the same reason as its Ford cousin, to satisfy NASCAR homologation rules while dominating high-speed oval racing. Mercury built somewhere between 300 and 600 examples, depending on which historical registry you trust, an almost embarrassingly small number for a major American automaker, which tells you everything about how little Mercury actually cared about selling these to normal customers. This was never really a consumer product. It was a rulebook loophole wearing a Mercury badge. And just like the Talladega, the moment NASCAR changed its aerodynamic regulations for 1970, the entire reason this car existed evaporated overnight. There was no civilian demand substantial enough to keep producing a car this specialized, this expensive to engineer, and this pointless without a racetrack to prove itself on. Mercury killed the Spoiler II after one single model year, and because so few were built to begin with. Genuine surviving examples today are almost mythical among collectors, some of the rarest aerodynamic warriors from an era when manufacturers were quite literally reshaping sheet metal just to satisfy a governing body's fine print. Now here's something worth pausing on before we go further, because there's a pattern forming that most people completely miss when they watch these car countdown videos. Every single vehicle so far wasn't killed because it was bad. It was killed specifically because it was too good at the one thing it was built to do. Detroit didn't murder failures. Detroit murdered its own greatest successes over and over again, because success attracted exactly the kind of regulatory and corporate attention nobody wanted. Keep that in mind, because the next car on this list takes that idea to an almost absurd extreme, involving a general manager, a corporate ban on racing, and a group of engineers who built cars in secret, literally hiding them from their own company. Number 5. The 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. This car sounds like an urban legend, and honestly, for decades, plenty of people assumed it was one. Chevrolet had an all-aluminum 427 cubic inch big block engine, originally developed for Can-Am racing, an engine so exotic and so expensive that putting it into a production car seemed financially insane. But a handful of Chevrolet dealers, most famously Illinois dealer Fred Gibb, working alongside Chevrolet performance manager Vince Piggins, exploited a loophole in General Motors' central office production order system, essentially a backdoor that let dealers order small batches of specialty vehicles built exactly to their specifications on the regular assembly line. They ordered 50 ZL1 Camaros as a minimum qualifying batch for NHRA drag racing certification, fully expecting most would sit unsold on lots because of the price. And the price was the entire problem. The aluminum ZL1 engine alone cost more than $4,000 as an option, at a time when an entire base model Camaro cost around $2,600. You could essentially buy two regular Camaros for the price of the ZL1 engine option alone. Dealerships were stunned when the invoices came in, and several reportedly tried to cancel their orders once they realized what they'd actually be charging customers. Chevrolet built exactly 69 ZL1 Camaros total across all participating dealers, a number so small it sounds fabricated, but it's verified by factory records. Most sat on dealer lots for months. Some were even converted back to iron block engines by frustrated dealers desperate to actually sell them at a normal price. General Motors' own corporate policy at the time officially discouraged this kind of expensive specialty racing homologation nonsense, viewing it as a financial and liability risk that didn't align with the buttoned-up image the corporation wanted to project. After 1969, the ZL1 engine option was pulled entirely. The aluminum big block was retired from civilian production, and this became a one-year-only artifact of dealers and engineers essentially running a guerrilla performance operation inside a massive corporation that didn't fully want it to exist. Today, a genuine numbers-matching ZL1 Camaro routinely sells for well over $500,000 at auction, making it one of the single greatest returns on investment in muscle car history, for a car General Motors basically tried to prevent from being built at all. Number 4. The 1963 Chevrolet Corvette Grand Sport. If you thought corporate interference was dramatic already, this next story involves engineers literally lying to their own management, and cars being built in secret facilities under false paperwork. In 1957, the Automobile Manufacturers Association, under pressure to project a safer, more responsible public image, got every major American automaker to sign a voluntary agreement banning factory involvement in racing. On paper, General Motors stopped racing entirely. In reality, legendary Corvette engineer Zora Arkus Duntov never stopped believing the Corvette needed to prove itself against European sports cars like Ferrari on the racetrack, and he quietly began developing a lightweight race-purpose Corvette specifically designed to demolish the competition at endurance races like Le Mans. Duntov planned to build 125 units, the minimum required by international racing homologation rules to classify the car as production-based rather than a pure prototype. His team built the cars using thinner fiberglass bodywork, a tubular steel chassis frame instead of the standard production frame, and planned to fit a purpose-built aluminum small block engine that could produce well over 500 horsepower, an almost unthinkable number for 1963. But General Motors executives discovered the project midway through production and, terrified of violating their own public racing ban and the potential embarrassment if the press found out, ordered the entire program shut down immediately. Only 5 complete Grand Sport chassis had been built by the time the corporate axe fell. Duntov and his team, refusing to let the project simply disappear, quietly arranged for the 5 existing cars to be sold or leaked to private racing teams under murky circumstances that GM's official history conveniently never fully explained. Those 5 cars went on to race, sometimes with factory parts still quietly flowing to them through backdoor channels, and became legendary giant killers on American racetracks. Today, each of the 5 surviving Grand Sport Corvettes is considered one of the most valuable American cars ever built, with insured values reportedly exceeding $10 million each, an almost unbelievable outcome for a car that officially wasn't even supposed to exist, killed after essentially zero official production run by executives who were more afraid of a press release than they were interested in building the greatest Corvette in history. Number 3. The 1970 AMC Rebel Machine. American Motors returns to this list, and once again, it's a story about a small company punching wildly above its weight class before getting crushed by circumstances beyond its control. By 1970, AMC desperately wanted a genuine seat at the muscle car table, competing directly against giants like the Plymouth Roadrunner and Dodge Superbird with a fraction of their budget. The result was the Rebel Machine, finished in a screaming patriotic red, white, and blue paint scheme with a functional hood scoop and a massive hood-mounted tachometer positioned directly in the driver's line of sight, a design detail borrowed straight from Trans Am racing that made the car feel like nothing else on a Detroit dealer lot. Underneath sat AMC's 390 cubic inch V8-producing 340 horsepower, paired with a heavy-duty 4-speed manual transmission, reinforced suspension components, and a twin-grip limited-slip differential, genuinely competitive hardware against anything the Big Three were building. Automotive magazines of the era tested the Rebel Machine, and were shocked at how legitimately quick this underdog from a company known mostly for economy cars actually was. It should have been the start of something bigger for AMC's performance ambitions. Instead, 1970 marked the absolute peak of muscle car era insurance premiums, with underwriters specifically targeting high-horsepower intermediate cars and charging young buyers rates that made these cars financially impossible to actually own and drive. On top of that, tightening emissions regulations were already forcing manufacturers to detune engines for the following model year, and AMC made the corporate decision to retire the Rebel nameplate entirely, replacing it with the new Matador for 1971. The machine's bold paint scheme, aggressive hood scoop, and race-inspired tachometer setup simply disappeared, absorbed into a blander, more conservative model lineup, better suited to survive the insurance crackdown and coming emissions era. Only around 2,200 Rebel machines were ever built, and because AMC as a company gets so little historical attention compared to Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler, this genuinely brilliant one-year muscle car remains one of the most overlooked performance vehicles of its entire era, killed not because it failed, but because the entire industry environment around it collapsed in the exact same 12 months it was born. Before we get to the final two, and trust me, these last two cars have stories even more dramatic than everything you've heard so far, let's talk about why this pattern kept repeating across an entire decade of American car manufacturing. It genuinely wasn't a coincidence. The late 60s and early 70s represented a razor-thin window where horsepower, corporate risk tolerance, and regulatory blindness all briefly aligned at the exact same moment. The second any single one of those three factors shifted, whether it was insurance companies waking up, racing bodies changing rulebooks, or executives getting nervous about liability, entire model lines got wiped out virtually overnight. And the final two cars on this list represent the single most extreme version of that entire phenomenon, cars so powerful, so expensive to insure, and so aggressively marketed that Detroit essentially had no choice but to pull the trigger and end them. Number 2. The 1971 Plymouth Hemi Cuda Convertible. Everything about this car represents the absolute final peak moment before Detroit's entire muscle car philosophy collapsed under its own weight. Plymouth offered the legendary 426 cubic inch Hemi engine, officially rated at 425 horsepower, though most enthusiasts believe the real number was considerably higher, as an option across the Barracuda lineup, and for 1971 specifically, buyers could order it in the open-top convertible body style, creating what many collectors now consider the single most desirable muscle car combination Detroit ever produced. The styling for 1971 introduced dramatic quad headlights, aggressive fender grills, and eye-catching high-impact paint colors with names like Lemon Twist, Curious Yellow, and In Violet, colors so bold that Chrysler dealers reportedly struggled to convince conservative buyers to actually drive one off the lot. But building a convertible with a massive, heavy, notoriously difficult-to-tune Hemi engine created serious practical problems. The convertible body structure already sacrificed rigidity compared to the hardtop, and stuffing in an engine this large and heavy created handling compromises that even-period road testers openly criticized. Combine that with skyrocketing insurance premiums specifically targeting anything with the word Hemi on the fender, tightening emissions standards, making the notoriously finicky Hemi increasingly difficult and expensive to certify, and a general market shift towards smaller, more efficient vehicles following the beginning of the oil crisis era, and Chrysler made the decision to discontinue the Hemi engine option entirely after 1971. Only 11 Hemi Cuda convertibles were built for the entire model year, a number so small that for years, some automotive historians genuinely debated whether all 11 actually existed, or if some production records had been miscounted. Today, a genuine, numbers matching 1971 Hemi Cuda convertible is considered among the most valuable American production cars ever built, with verified auction sales exceeding $3.5 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for a car built in a factory alongside completely ordinary family sedans, killed the very same year it reached its absolute performance and styling peak. And finally, number 1, the 1970 Plymouth Superbird. If you've made it this far, you already understand the pattern. Brilliant, dominant cars getting killed the moment they succeed too much. But nothing on this entire list captures that idea more perfectly, or more absurdly, than what happened to the Superbird. Plymouth built this car for one specific purpose: to lure legendary NASCAR driver Richard Petty back to the Plymouth brand after he'd left to drive for Ford, and to give Plymouth a genuine weapon in the same aerodynamic superspeedway wars we talked about earlier with the Talladega and Cyclone Spoiler II. Engineers stretched the nose an extra 19 inches beyond a standard Roadrunner, added a massive rear wing mounted on tall struts specifically calculated through wind tunnel testing to sit above the disturbed air flowing off the roofline, and created something so aerodynamically extreme that it looked almost cartoonish, parked next to a normal Plymouth on a dealer lot. Underneath, buyers could order either a 440 cubic inch V8 or the legendary 426 Hemi, and on NASCAR superspeedways, the Superbird was virtually unbeatable, helping Plymouth dominate the 1970 racing season exactly as intended. But here's where the story gets almost impossible to believe. Regular customers walking into Plymouth dealerships had absolutely no interest in buying what looked like an alien spacecraft with a wing on the back. The extreme styling that made it a racing legend made it a genuine sales disaster in showrooms across America. Plymouth built around 1,935 Superbirds to satisfy NASCAR's homologation requirement, and dealers simply could not move them. Some sat unsold for over a year, with desperate dealerships slashing prices dramatically below sticker just to clear inventory. And in a detail that sounds almost too strange to be true but is thoroughly documented, several dealers actually removed the massive rear wing and nose cone entirely, converting unsold Superbirds back to standard-looking Roadrunners, just to make them sellable to buyers who wanted absolutely nothing to do with the wild aerodynamic styling. NASCAR, watching the Superbird and its rivals completely dominate racing, changed the rulebook for 1971, essentially banning cars with this level of aerodynamic modification, unless manufacturers built an impossibly large number of civilian units, a number Plymouth had zero interest in even attempting. With the racing purpose eliminated and dealers still struggling to sell leftover units from a single model year, Plymouth killed the Superbird after exactly 1 year of production. Decades later, the exact same buyers who avoided this car in 1970 because it looked too strange are now paying well over $300,000 at auction for pristine surviving examples, transforming what was once considered an unsellable showroom embarrassment into one of the single most valuable and recognizable muscle cars in American automotive history. It remains the single greatest example of a car Detroit built to win, immediately succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, and then killed within 12 months because that exact success had become impossible to sustain. So which one of these one-year wonders would you actually want sitting in your garage right now? The aerodynamic outlaw that dealers couldn't even give away, the secret racing Corvette that officially never existed, or the accidental muscle car that beat Detroit to the entire concept a decade early? Let us know down in the comments which forgotten machine deserves more recognition, and if this countdown kept you hooked until the very end, do us a favor and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next hidden chapter of American automotive history that Detroit tried its absolute best to bury.